Hello, everyone. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and welcome again to our good friend Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute. And thanks for joining us from across the ocean in Potsdam, Germany. Harley, how are you today?
Doing pretty well. It's good to be back with you.
Yeah, it's been a month now, and so much has happened. And I guess I would like to start by just giving kudos to the LaRouche and Schiller youth people that have been out really shaking the platforms, shaking up the politicians, and making a lot of noise for peace. And I congratulate you and your movement for organizing and supporting and teaching the young people how it's done. Of course, you're one of the originals, so it's also a great honor to talk to you this morning. So very good to have you, Harley, and well done with all that you guys are doing for peace.
Well, I think it's what everyone should do. I mean, if people actually understood what we're facing historically and understood the history, the backstory of the history, they'd be out, there'd be more people in the street. I mean, last weekend, there are estimates that between Indonesia, Europe, cities in the United States, the Arab world, there are over 3.5 million people demonstrating for what? To kill Jews? No, for a ceasefire, to stop the killing of innocent civilians in Gaza. And so I think it's important that everyone who has a heart and who can feel the pain of the people in Israel who lost loved ones in the October 7th attack, that they look across the border at the Palestinians and realize that more of them are going through the same thing. And you're not going to get peace by killing children. So the reason that we're out as much as we are, I mean, I've written half a dozen articles in the last few days. I've done interviews all over the world because people want to know the background to what is it that's caused this situation? Why is there so much hatred? And there's a famous Yiddish proverb I've been quoting, which is one God, so many enemies. And that's a comment about the Middle East. So, if people think about it, you realize that we've strayed away from the idea of what is the responsibility of human beings to our Creator. And it's not to kill out of vengeance, but to find a pathway to allow more people to live a good life, a safe life, a prosperous life. And that's not what we're seeing with the Biden policy of backing up the what in a sense is genocide and ethnic cleansing against the Palestinian people.
I was just going to ask you that. It is, and I would agree with you that it is genocide. And as you see the people leaving the northern part of Gaza, just being driven to migrate down, I guess, to the southern part of Gaza, where once again they're not going to have any answers as far as the Israeli defense minister is concerned. These are all subhumans, and they need to be exterminated. And this type of thinking by someone who is nominally Jewish is just unbelievable. So how these things happen is not apparent on the surface. Why do people get so radical? And I my studies tell me it has to do with money. It has to do with perhaps that area in Gaza has a certain value, and they'd like to get the current residents to move so that they could bring in some new stuff, like maybe a nice port in the city of Gaza, maybe a terminal for an oil pipeline from the Gulf of Aqaba, or perhaps uh, move all those people out of there and then move them somewhere else where they'd be useful as laborers. Say we need to build pipelines in Saudi Arabia, so let's make them go there. I think that the idea of huge financial powers causing people to move like this, even to the extent of using war and terrorism and genocide, is not new. And what is Genie Energy? What is going on with regard to the oil companies and the oil leases? how is Israel itself is divided over this issue, with a lot of Jewish voices for peace. That group is very active. The politics in Israel have always been strongly divided. But what do you see it? I mean, to me, I'm suspicious that it is all about the Benjamins, as they say. What do you think?
Well, look, that plays a role on the lower level, because if you're someone in Israel and looking at prime real estate in Gaza or Jerusalem or the Golan Heights, then it makes sense to say we're willing to go to war to protect it. But that's not what this is about, really. It's much more about a question of who has power, the power to control the situation. And that's why you have to go back and look at it in history, because this whole situation in the Middle East was set up essentially at the end of the 19th century by the City of London. And it had to do with, I mean, you go back a little earlier, you had the Crimean War in the 1850s, you had the Great Game in Afghanistan in the 1860s. In the 1860s, were Russians and Brits killing each other in Afghanistan over strategic metals? Well, they didn't even know about it then. So why were they killing each other in Afghanistan at that time? It has to do with this idea of geopolitics, the merger of geography and raw political power, which can be translated into money. I mean, the British promoted the idea of geopolitics to defend their empire, their right to determine the terms of trade, to determine who has the trading routes and so on. But if you look at this situation, I go back to the 19th century and the early 20th century, the fight was between the European powers at that time, France and Britain, over who would control the area in what's today called the Middle East when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And the Ottoman Empire collapsing had been going on for 100 years. And the British were terrified that the Russians would come in and dominate the landmass, or perhaps the Germans. Remember, there was the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad in the early 1900s. There was an agreement in 1907 to carve up Iran between Russia and Britain. This had a lot to do with the trade routes and the ability to control the mass that was an intersection between Asia, Africa, and Europe, and also the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. So there are all these factors. Now, the average Israeli soldier that's shooting at someone in Gaza, or the average Hamas terrorist, if there is such a thing, doesn't usually think about these things. They're on a mission. Their mission is to kill the enemy. But the people who are calling the shots do think about these things. And so in that sense, John, I would say there are two things to look at in terms of the outbreak of the current crisis. One, the emergence of an alternative financial system potentially around the BRICS. Notice that 5 of the 6 new BRICS members are from this neighborhood: Ethiopia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and United Arab Emirates. And the idea, I think, for some was, can we break them from Russia and China? Can we force them to recognize their home is with the West? Now, that's one aspect to it. The other aspect to it is the fact that Netanyahu represents a specific version of Zionism, which is a filthy, bloody, corrupt, and in this case, money-oriented version, which basically says the Bible, the Old Testament, is a real estate contract giving the land between the Nile and the Tigris River to the Jews. And so we have a right to reclaim it. And that's what Netanyahu's movement, the so-called revisionist movement or Greater Israel movement. But before it was in Israel, it was in London. It was the British Israelite faction, which the people in the British royal family and people who served the British royal family spent the middle part of the 19th century exploring the area to map out where they could buy homes, build castles, because they believed that the British are the original descendants of Jesus. And you can get into all this cult stuff with it. But that's really where the squirrel buried the nuts. You have these kinds of ideas about power and control. And so then you look at what was done practically. 1916, Sykes-Picot, the British and the French divided up the region. The French took the northern part, Lebanon, Iraq, and ceded to the British Jordan, Palestine, and the northern Arabian Peninsula. And what right did they have to divide it up? So then a year later, the Balfour Declaration, Lord Balfour sends a letter to Lord Rothschild, the titular head of the British Zionist movement, promising a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. Well, there weren't that many Jews in Palestine at that point. Most of them were still in Europe. But this is the kind of manipulation. And if you look at those two events, you'll see the seeds for everything that's being fought out today. And whatever Netanyahu says, whatever Hamas or Hezbollah say, this is a succession of a long cycle of manipulation from the outside that plays the Israelis against the Arabs and the Palestinians. And as soon as people figure that out, as Rabin did, and as Yasser Arafat eventually did, that they were being used as pawns in a war for someone else, once they figured it out, they could come up with a plan for peace. And then what happened? Well, the bankers sabotaged the Oslo economic accords, and Netanyahu's buddies killed Rabin. So this is where we are today, in the midst of a almost nihilistic existentialist crisis, which has solutions, but you have to go outside of the mainstream narrative and outside of the political networks to find the solutions, because otherwise you get drawn into the cycle of hatred.
And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? Jerusalem, an old hymn which I know because I studied Paul Robeson's work, and he sings it just so beautifully. There is that tradition, the Israelite tradition. It's fascinating to try to dig into that as we dig into the early 17th century and all of the obscure but still existing traces of these things. Cromwell, of course, and the introduction of Jews back into England is a big watershed in human history, and one which I think still casts a shadow today in terms of who's financing what. Amazing to think of Zionism in the cold, hard terms that you just expressed it. I think it's very important that that let those adjectives resonate when we say Zionism, because it is a genocidal religion, if it's a religion. And when Joe Biden says he is a Zionist, that's what he's talking about. And so a lot of this explains that. To me, it's a bargain with the devil. It's selling your soul, saying, okay, I'm going to accept the idea that I am one of the super chosen people that has the right to do whatever I want with all the rest of humanity. It's the same thing that the Tavistock people have been preaching, and the same thing that comes back again to Palmerston, and as you and I have talked many times, the interest of the British Empire is interest. They have no friends, and it's like you said, a god with too many enemies. Well, England is a country with no friends and willing to exploit.
Only interests, as Palmerston said.
Exactly.
I would recommend, there's a book over my shoulder here, Rabin, Our Life, His Legacy. It's a beautifully emotional book written by Leah Rabin 2 years after his assassination. He just passed the 28th anniversary of his murder on November 4th. And the important thing about Rabin is, here was a guy who was in the mold of the old-fashioned Zionist, not the Netanyahu Zionist, but the European Zionists who said, well, we're going to develop this land. We're going to make it a safe haven for Jews. And the way we're going to do that is through a policy which was called the Iron Wall, which is that Israel will be strong enough militarily to protect itself from the Palestinians and the Arab neighbors, but would have within it a system of democracy and justice. And this was somewhat of the illusion, but Rabin was from that school. And in the 1980s, he was the commander in the Six-Day War in 1967. He was the one who led the Israeli troops that took Jerusalem and all the occupied territories, Golan Heights, Gaza, Jerusalem, the West Bank, and so on. But in the 80s, when he was the defense minister, he was assigned the task of putting down the Intifada. Now, the Intifada occurred when Israeli policemen killed a couple of Palestinian protesters, and the Palestinian young people went into the streets. They were armed with rocks and bottles. And the initial strategy was to use heavy force, not lethal force, but batons, tear gas, demolish homes, expel some people, put them in jail. And Rabin was in charge of that. But what Leah Rabin writes is that he'd come home every night questioning, is this what Israel is meant to do? And she writes in the book that he concluded that Israel is not meant to be the policeman of other people. It's not meant to be the controller of other peoples. And so a few years later, he had an opportunity to do something about it. You had the Madrid conference in 1991. Now, this is part of the history no one remembers. But this was right after the first Gulf War, and you had a crisis continuing that was related to the Intifada. You had in the 80s a war in Lebanon and several other things going on. And so then the question was, could you get a peace conference going? Now, Shamir, who is a predecessor of Netanyahu from the same radical Greater Israel Zionist faction, Shamir was not willing at all to consider a Palestinian state, even though that was international law that Israel had agreed to. So, but the Shamir government asked for money from the United States, Zelensky style. We need money to build new settlements. Now, here's where you see the difference between Rabin and the extreme Greater Israel Zionists. Rabin said, well, maybe we need a couple settlements in the West Bank just for defensive reasons, not massive housing projects and agriculture, but just some defense outposts. Shamir said, no, we want to resettle 500,000 to 1 million Jews in these areas. So we established what Sharon called facts on the ground. You can't have a Palestinian state because the Jews own all the land. So Rabin was opposed to that, but he wasn't in power. Shamir was. So he went to Bush and he said, give us $10 million and we'll be able to effectively settle this area, or give us a loan guarantee, rather. I'm probably wrong on the figure. I think it was 10 billion. And the United States said, well, you have to show some desire to have a peace agreement. So they set up something called the Madrid Conference. Now, the Palestinians were not allowed to participate because Shamir was enforcing a law which said Israelis can't talk to Palestinians. But they did allow a couple Palestinians in the delegation, but it never went anywhere. For 2 years, there were these talks going on. But in the middle of 1992, Rabin beat Shamir in an election. And he beat him because he made a pledge to make this agreement work. And that included direct contact with Palestinians, and it included a freeze on settlements. But even that didn't work in Madrid. So what did they do? They sent their operatives, Shimon Peres's younger group of economists and strategists, met with Arafat's team in Oslo. And that's where the Oslo Accord came from. And the key to the Oslo Accord was mutual recognition, an end to fighting, and economic cooperation. And this is what Rabin fought for the last 2 years of his life. And in September 93, he and Arafat shocked the world and probably each other when they shook hands on the White House lawn. And Rabin praised Arafat as someone who had the courage to change his axioms. And Arafat in turn said, our people, our children, want to live in peace with your children. And there's some beautiful speeches made. Clinton was his usual flowery self. But then what happened? The key was the economic annexes. Will we have joint projects to increase the amount of water? Because there's not enough water for Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel, and Palestine. So LaRouche had drafted a proposal called the Oasis Plan. Build canals from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea and from the Dead Sea to the Red Sea. Line them with nuclear power plants that give you the energy to desalinate the water and create more man-made Jordan rivers in the region. And then use the power as well to build factories, to upgrade agricultural production and transportation corridors. Now, not exactly LaRouche's proposal, but something very close to it was in the two economic annexes which were part of Oslo. Now, hardly anyone knows that. There's a reason for that. There had been a proposal from Shimon Peres in the mid-'80s when he was prime minister for what he called a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. And he asked for $30 to $50 billion from international donors. Well, they then said, let's do that for Oslo. And they actually collected, I think initially, almost $15 billion pledges. But what happened is the World Bank said they would not forward that money to the Palestinians because they didn't trust them, that they were corrupt, they would use it to buy arms, and so on. And so the money was never there. So the projects never got started. And then on November 4th, 1995, Yigal Amir, a crazy settler who was living in this swamp of hateful rabbis who said the Palestinians have no right to this land, we've got to drive them out, the Netanyahu crowd, and so on. Yigal Amir went up to Rabin after the largest peace rally ever in Israel in Tel Aviv. He went up to him and shot him 3 times and killed him. And from that point forward, Netanyahu stepped into the breach. And not that long ago, Netanyahu told a group that he takes personal credit for sabotaging Oslo, the Oslo Accord. So that's what we're dealing with. People who, as Leah Rabin says in this book, what do you do with people where a piece of land is more valuable than a child's life? And that's, as we say in Yiddish, that's the Meshugana outlook of the settlers movement. And that's the base of Netanyahu. The good news, John, and I'm sorry if I'm rattling on too long on this, but the good news is that there's significant opposition in Israel to Netanyahu, as we saw with hundreds of thousands of people, including Israel Defense Force reservists, coming into the streets against his judicial reforms. This was before October 7th. And now we're seeing Israelis starting to speak out again, and they're asking the question, is it really the case that the Israel Defense Forces were caught off guard, that this was an intelligence failure? Because it certainly serves the purposes of Netanyahu to have an intelligence failure that gives him an excuse to go in and try and wipe out Gaza. It also, ironically, serves the war hawks in the United States. You know, in an article I said it was like manna from heaven for them. Because what happens? Well, they were running into huge problems getting budget allocations for Ukraine because that war is turned bad on the United States. So what does Biden do? He links Ukraine and Israel in a budget bill to try to get another $100 billion for war. 60-something billion for Ukraine, almost 15 billion for Israel, a couple of billion for the border, some more money for the Pacific, the coming war with China and so on. So they tried to take advantage of this the way they always do. And then you have John Bolton running around saying we have to turn Iran into a parking lot. Lindsey Graham saying we have to destroy Iran's oil system, oil industry. So, you know, what we're looking at is the empire is breaking down, and they're trying to figure out how to change the subject so they can maintain their preeminence economically and politically in this so-called unipolar order. And that's what this is really all about. And people who are jumping up and down cheering for one side or the other are being manipulated. They're being played by this permanent war faction.
You mentioned earlier that the Oslo Accord was broken up by the financiers, by the bankers. But you also mentioned that it is Netanyahu claiming credit for breaking up Oslo, and he did it as a Zionist. In other words, as a committed, you know, movement that he believes in. Hopefully in his heart, if he has one, that he has the duty and right to wipe out these Palestinians because of his religious beliefs. Yahweh did it, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, blame Yahweh.
But you see, there's a connection between those two things because, first of all, Netanyahu, as far as I know, is not very religious. But for him, Zionism is a creed, a belief structure, kind of a cult. But when I say he claims credit for breaking it up, what he meant is that after the Oslo Accord was signed, and this again is described very vividly in Leah Rabin's book, there were demonstrations regularly, not large demonstrations, but smaller numbers of people who were part of the Likud party, part of the religious parties, the Koch party of the crazy Meir Kahane, the Jewish Defense League rabbi. You had all these different groups that were going around saying Rabin is a traitor to Judaism. They issued something called a din rodef, which means if someone has the opportunity to kill him, they can do it because he's risking the lives of Jews by the Oslo Agreement. So it was deeply held beliefs that were laundered through religion, but which had to do with this idea that this land is ours, we're going to keep it, we're not going to give it up. And again, that was being played from the outside. It was being protected from the outside. And so in that sense, the antidote to that would have been, what if you had economic projects that had benefit for both Israeli and Palestinians? Industrial centers, agricultural projects, power, water management, and so on that benefited both parties plus the other Arab neighbors. Well, that would go a long way toward eliminating hate. That's the principle of the Peace of Westphalia. That's what John Kennedy was talking about in June 1963 in the American University speech when he said, we have to see this situation through the eyes of the other side. Now, that's something that if you try to do that on Gaza, if you try to say, well, maybe there's a reason Hamas did this, maybe it may be crazy and should be condemned, but maybe there's a reason for it. Oh, no, you're a Hamas supporter, you're an anti-Semite. If you even question the human rights violations going on in Gaza today, you can be, as the Jewish Voices for Peace that sang in the Capitol Rotunda, the Anti-Defamation League denounced them as anti-Semites, even though they were Jewish. The same ADL, which didn't have a word to say about a Ukrainian Nazi getting cheered in the Canadian Parliament. So, the hypocrisy here goes beyond religion and goes into these deep belief structures, which have been honed over the centuries by the hybrid warfare operations at Oxford, Cambridge, and the British Empire.
So the British Empire in the 19th century decides they want to have a peace in the Middle East that they can control because of the importance of it as a controlling point for the world trade. And they need to be sure that they have it. And they come up with this idea called Zionism. And this is a totally different Zionism than existed before that. I was riding around, driving through rural Pennsylvania on this weekend from Carlisle down to Frederick, Maryland, and you go through some of the old country there, and I came upon a cemetery in front of me. It's one of those old ones with the iron built a fence around it, and across the top of it, it had the name of the cemetery. The name of the cemetery is Mount Zion.
Yeah.
And that reminded me of another Paul Robeson song, On My Journey Now. I'm on my journey now, Mount Zion. And that sense of Zion goes back to the Puritans and the Pilgrims and the original British Israelites that thought of Zion not as a place on earth, but as the ultimate goal for Christians to get to heaven. So I'm on my journey to Mount Zion, and when you get there, your body goes into the ground, and your soul goes up to Jerusalem, and in that sense of Jerusalem representing a spiritual place. And so it's so difficult now to sort out these words, especially Zionism, but. And I think that people like Netanyahu get a lot of cover from people's more fundamental Christian idea of Zionism that still exists, and is
and that is also from the British, the Darbyites, the movement of Derby in the 1850s. This was something which was at a time when the British Empire was having a rough period. They'd lost America. The Civil War went against what Palmerston wanted. And what they did is they launched this movement, which essentially said, and this goes back to Cromwell, that the second coming will occur when all the Jews are in Jerusalem.
Yep.
And once they're all there, then you'll have the Battle of Armageddon, and the Jews who accept Jesus. And I think the strict interpretation from Revelation is that will be 144,000 of them. And all the rest will be wiped out in the battles. And this is the Christian Zionism that's preached every single Sunday in hundreds of churches across the United States, as espoused especially by Reverend John Hagee of the Cornerstone Baptist Church in San Antonio, Texas, who has a very powerful influence on he was an insider with the Bush family. So you have these kinds of networks. And the average person who talks about this stuff, the Battle of Armageddon and Jesus will come back, most of them just say these things without thinking about what they're saying. But this is then used by the various lobbies in Washington, D.C. to say to the Congress, look, your constituents want us to fund Israel because they want to protect Israel from anti-Semitism. Well, how is it protecting Jews to say that all but 144,000 of them are going to be killed in the Battle of Armageddon? I used to joke that the closest some of these Christian fundamentalists used to come to Jews in the South was when they burned crosses in their yards. So, and I'm not saying this to deride people's personal beliefs, but you have to look at where these things come from. This is not what Jesus was preaching. And people who call themselves Christians should realize that Jesus and then his apostles were on a mission to the Jewish people and then to the non-Jews of the world. But their mission was not against the Jews. It was for universal salvation. And, this is where you see how religion becomes a tool in the hands of people who have the money to create these kinds of semi-religious cults. And
boy, do they create these semi-religious cults. And, that's a great example of an early instance of it that's still there today. The Schofield Bible.
Exactly.
That's another. And the fact is, these TV preachers have always been subsidized by CIA or other, like secret money from the Ford Foundation or something like that.
And did you see this confab in Las Vegas, the Jewish Republican Conference, where every single Republican candidate for president went there to kiss Miriam Adelson's rear end because her late husband, Sheldon Adelson, was the one who gave, I don't know, maybe $100 million between 2016 and 2020 to Trump. And there was Trump in the middle of this, pointing to Miriam Adelson in the crowd saying, hey, Miriam, we delivered for you, didn't we? Getting that, U.S. embassy moved to Jerusalem. It was the pandering of all of them. But to me, to see Trump do that when his whole rationale has been he kept us out of war. Well, he's not keeping us out of this war. He's saying that we should fund the Israelis to give them everything they need. And remember, he also targeted Iran by canceling the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, by killing Soleimani, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard leader. Actually, he admitted he planned that with Netanyahu, but even Netanyahu wasn't that crazy. He backed out of it at the last minute. So these are strands that get into everyday politics, and it explains a lot why no one will stand up and protest about the money going to Israel, except a handful of people like the Talib and a few people in the squad, who on many things are, way off the wall. But on this, they're defending this question of the human rights of the victims, the children of the Palestinians who are being disproportionately killed by the Israeli assault.
Yeah. Thinking of a Bob Marley song, One Love, and, it says, one love. I hear the children crying, one love, one heart. And then the other line is, some say it's all a part of it. We have to fulfill the book. And that, he's saying, there's some people out there that are so believing in the Old Testament version of history that they're taking it literally. And that literal interpretation is a horrible impediment to progress and world peace and what, as you say, Jesus, and I think every other responsible religious leader would say, if you don't want it done to you, don't do it to somebody else. Yeah. It's I've heard the Talmud quoted for that. I've heard the Bible quoted for that. Jesus, it's everybody says it. So how do you get rid of this cancer in our world?
Well, I think the important thing is this idea that was expressed explicitly by Kennedy, by Rabin, that you have to look through the eyes of the other and see what the world the way they see it. For example, did Putin have legitimate security concerns over Ukraine? Now, I've never met anyone, when you try and pin it down to that point, they'll say, oh no, NATO never intended to do something against Putin. Well, then why did NATO lie? If you really pin it down, you'll see that you can't argue that Putin didn't have legitimate security concerns, especially after 14,000 people in the Donbass were killed. But he spent 8 years trying to turn that around. Now, if people, there are two ways to do this. One is you have to educate people on the real issues here, that we have a collapsing imperial system, and they're trying to distract you and also use their war machines to defeat the potential adversaries who are building a new system. So that's one way you can do it. But the other way is simple human-to-human basis. And this is why I think the Western media is somewhat hesitant to show what's really going on in Gaza. And it's partly that it's hard to do because the Israelis are blocking the stream, but some of these things get through on social media, and you see that the mother crying over a 2-year-old child that's been killed in a missile attack. That could be a mother anywhere in the world, and no children deserve to die supposedly in a fight against terrorism. The 2-year-old child is not involved in that fight. And I think we have to wage a fight on that level, and then at the same time show them that what are the Americans getting from our support of the Ukraine proxy war against Russia? How do we benefit from Israel crushing the Hamas in Gaza? There's no benefit for the United States to these things. U.S. credibility has collapsed. You see what happened to Blinken when he went to meet with King Abdullah, the Jordan king, who they've always been very strong American allies. Abdullah closed the door and lectured him, and then didn't allow Blinken to answer. You know, the United States is losing credibility with a growing percentage of the world's population. We were one of 14 nations at the UN General Assembly that voted against a ceasefire. 120 other nations voted for the ceasefire. So 120 to 14. The US was one of the 14. And pressuring many other nations to abstain, because I think about 40-something nations abstained in the vote who would have voted for a ceasefire. So we're not being helped by this. And I think if people can get to the point of trying to have a human connection to what it means to be put through this kind of suffering. And I'm not excluding the suffering of the Israelis. You know, the attack by Hamas was pretty brutal. Not the same as we've been told in the media, the babies' heads cut off and things of that sort, but it was a brutal assault. So where does understanding come from? It has to come from what Jesus talked about. You have to love your neighbor. You have to have an ability to not want revenge, but instead have forgiveness. And that's hard. Rabin said it was very, very hard for him. But that's why I encourage people to read this book, because I don't agree with everything Leah Rabin says, but it's a very powerful review of the emotional pull that Yitzhak Rabin had in trying to do the right thing for Israel.
Who's the author?
Leah Rabin.
Oh, okay.
It's called Our Life, His Legacy.
Okay. Well, Harley, I told you before the show, and I didn't tell everybody else, but I do have to cut the show off a little early today because of an appointment. So got about 2 minutes left, Harley, and I'm going to leave it to you if you anything else you'd like to add or something new you'd like to bring in.
Well, something very interesting just happened, and I don't have a lot of details on it, but there was a conference in Afghanistan sponsored by the Ibn Sina Foundation on talking about how to rebuild Afghanistan. And the Schiller Institute was prominently involved in the conference. So they invited people from the Schiller Institute. Since this was our, Helga Zepp-LaRouche made this proposal. And it was basically, again, the United States stole $9 billion from Afghanistan, leaving children to starve. And so what we called for is the world to come together with humanitarian aid. And now we see the Taliban responding positively to that. And keep in mind also, the Taliban, confirmed by the UN, has cut down opium production in Afghanistan by 98%. So maybe there's a possibility to establish a new relationship between the West and Afghanistan.
Well, I wish I could say I'm hopeful with that, but it seems like we've got more fentanyl in this country than ever. And whether it's coming from Afghanistan or somewhere else like China, it doesn't really matter. It's still killing our kids and taking lives away at a terrible rate. So that's just another aspect of the attack on America, an attack on sovereignty, and an attack on really what you guys fight for, which is a world of human value, and trusting that one another can live by that golden rule that we all talk about. Thanks so much.
Okay, John. Talk to you in 2 weeks.
All right. I look forward to it.
Okay.
Bye now.
Bye.